If you're recording yourself, if you're the performer, chances are your control room and your studio are one and the same. And that may apply even if you're recording other people. But if you have the opportunity to have a separate space for your control room, it will improve your recording significantly. It's impossible to tell what you're getting if you're in the same room as where the music's being produced. So you can't tell the quality of your recording until everybody stops playing and you listen back to the recording. This can take a lot of time, and that can be a problem if you're trying to capture the moment. So you're always better off if there's any way you can devise a separate control room. And that control room should be well isolated from the recording space. As we learned in the segment on acoustics, the way you achieve isolation between two spaces is by having walls that have high mass and they're perfectly sealed. In our situation, we use our shop as the control room, and this space is not really very big. It would be ideal if it was somewhat larger, but it's adequate. And it's pretty well isolated from the rest of the recording spaces, both the basement and the garage. Most of the wall between the two spaces is concrete block, which provides us with our mass. It's reasonably well sealed. The door is reasonably well sealed, and we get adequate isolation between the spaces. If you're recording drums and you can hear the bass drum or even any of the other drums through the wall with your monitors turned down, it's going to influence your perception of how to record those drums. If you find that when you play the drums back they sound different than you did when you were recording them, chances are the difference is because of the bleed through of the sound through your wall. For many of us that's unavoidable, and we just have to learn to live with it, and we have to know after a while the sound that we're getting in the control room is not going to be exactly what we're going to hear when we hear the actual recording. Now, just like acoustics are important in the recording space, they're just as important in your monitoring environment in the control room. The same rules of acoustics apply. Absorption, diffusion, resonance all come into play when you're dealing with the sound of your control room. In our control room, we have a situation where the floor is concrete on the ground, so that provides a completely solid surface, completely reflective. It has a layer of carpeting on top of that. The walls are drywall that are mounted on studs, which are spaced out slightly from concrete block outer walls. There are 3 windows and 2 doors in this space, and they also provide different situations as far as acoustics are concerned. And the ceiling is acoustic tile, which provides that absorption of high frequencies, but relatively minimal absorption of low and mid frequencies. Like the basement, there's a subfloor and oak flooring above this, and some of that sound in our control room at the low frequencies and mid frequencies is absorbed by that space above. Some of it's also absorbed by the windows. So what we end up with is a space that's actually acoustically pretty good. Like the basement storage area, we achieve a lot of diffusion because there's a lot of stuff in this room. There's more storage shelves, there's racks of equipment, there's test benches, there's workbenches. All those things provide a variety of reflective and absorptive surfaces which provide a great deal of diffusion in the room. It's going to be very difficult to get a good recording if you can't hear what you're getting. So good monitoring is extremely important. There's a wide variety of monitor speakers out there, and you have to decide what sounds right to you and what's the best tool for you to use. But keep in mind, monitor speakers are not there to provide you with beautiful sound necessarily, but they're there to provide you with a tool that allows you to hear what's going on in your recording. In our control room, what I use for monitors are old UREI 811B speakers. These are about 30 years old, and they're actually an updated version of the Alltech 604, which was a standard monitor speaker used in recording from around the 1950 until maybe into the 1980s. These speakers provide a fairly wide range of frequencies with a 15-inch woofer and a horn tweeter. Now, one of the problems with a system like this is the horn is highly directive, which means you have to be right on axis in order to hear it properly. So that means there can't be anything in between you and the speaker, and you have to be looking basically right down the horn throat in order to hear it properly. This means that other people in the room may not hear the same thing you're hearing if you're sitting in the right spot and they're off to the side. So these speakers aren't for everybody, and I'm not sure that I would recommend them to you anyway, but they're speakers that I've sat in front of for many, many thousands of hours of recording sessions, and they're what I'm used to, and they're a reference for me that I understand completely. No matter what speakers you decide to use, you need to stick with them, get used to them, learn how they sound, learn how what you hear translates into the way that you're recording sound in other environments, and then stick with those and make sure that you keep that reference in your mind at all times. Now, in addition to the UREI speakers, I also have here in the control room Quested 2108s and also Unity Rock speakers. All three of these systems are very good monitor speakers, and I like them all, but I very rarely switch between them. And the reason is that I find that it just confuses me. For me, the UREI speakers are the ones that are my reference, and they're the ones that I know when I make sound a certain way in those is going to translate well into the outside world. I don't have the same level of experience with the other speakers, but it's interesting to switch between them on occasion. But for me, I would never make any decisions based on something that sounded different on the other speakers. Our situation's probably like many of yours, and that is that we can't keep this control room set up as a control room all the time. The space is needed for other purposes. So when we set up for recording, we bring in the various other pieces of equipment that we need and set it up, hook up the cables, and then we're ready to record. At the end, we have to take it all down and put it all away. In our space, the exception is the speaker systems stay here, and also the equipment in the rack stays here. But the other things all are taken apart and put away. Although these tutorials have focused on the technical aspects of recording, recording is much more than that, and we're going to talk about some of these other aspects as well. If you're recording yourself, you obviously know the music very well, and you probably have a pretty good idea of what you want it to sound like. But if you're working with other people, you may need to have a better understanding of what the concept of the song is before you start recording. You know, traditionally in recording, the roles of producer, engineer, and musician were all separate. The musicians obviously produced the music, and the engineer obviously ran the equipment to record it, and the producer was the one that acted as a go-between between those two groups. Today, often those lines between those functions are blurred, and often it's just the same person. If you're recording yourself, you're both the performer, the engineer, and the producer. For most home recording, there isn't somebody that's designated as producer, but everybody fulfills that role to some extent. And one of the jobs as a producer is to make sure that the musicians are ready when they come into the studio. And that probably means spending time with them at their rehearsal, or at least listening to rough recordings they've made of their rehearsals, so that you know exactly what they're going for. Most of us are pretty busy, and we don't do recording as a full-time job, and we have many other obligations and responsibilities, so when it comes time to record, it's a treat to be able to do it, but it also means we have to do it efficiently. We don't have the luxury of spending days and days and days recording. So therefore, it's important that when everybody comes to the session, they're ready to go. That means they understand the song, they know the structure, they know the chord changes. Those are the fundamentals that obviously shouldn't be an issue. But in addition to that, they also have to have the same concept of the song. Everybody has to be on the same page. Now, if you have a singer-songwriter whose material you're recording, chances are they've communicated to the rest of the musicians exactly what they're looking for. And with people they've worked with over years, they probably have a pretty good rapport with them, and they can get exactly the sound they're looking for. You, as recordists, have a similar obligation, and it means that you should know the song ahead of time, ideally, and more importantly, you should understand what the artist is looking for, where they're going with it, what's the important core of that song, and how that's going to get across to the listener. In any musical situation, you have to remember that the key people in it are the people making the music and the people listening to the music. The performer and the listener are the key people. Your job as recordist is to capture that performance in a way that translates it perfectly for the listener. It's important that you not get in the way of that interface between the performer and the listener. Now, that's not to say that you can't be a part of the team. Your job isn't just there to provide an exact translation of what's going on in the studio, but part of your job is also to make the creative decisions in your recording that enhances the artist's vision. Chances are your situation is like what we have here. We can't leave everything set up all the time. So when the time comes to do a recording session, we start setting up well in advance so that we're ready when the musicians arrive. Often that means starting the day before. Ideally, we already know the song that they're going to be recording and have spent some time listening to it and understanding it so that we can get ready. We know what musicians are coming in and what instruments they're going to be playing, where we want to set them up, and we can set up a lot of that ahead of time. You should be all set up and ready to go before the musicians arrive and have everything tested. Make sure you know exactly which microphone's going to which mic preamp, and that's going to what input on your recorder, and have all that labeled, notated, and ready so you don't have to spend time trying to figure out which mic is that and where is it going. If you're using stereo pairs of mics, make sure you know which is left and which is right. It may not make a difference in many cases, and you can always reverse it later, but if you get it right now, it makes it easier. You want to make your recording space comfortable for the musicians. You don't want them to be distracted by things that are making them uncomfortable. So the temperature has to be right. The lighting has to be right. You have to have comfortable chairs for them or whatever they need in order to perform comfortably. It's important for the musicians to be able to communicate with each other, not only visually but also by being able to hear themselves and the others properly. In some situations, they may be able to sit in the room and perform just as if they were playing their song for friends, and their communications between each other is very good. However, in most cases, we're dealing with sounds that are not really compatible. It's very difficult for somebody to hear a singer singing over a drum set next to them. So we provide headphones and isolation between our musical sources so that the performers can all hear perfectly what each other is doing. We talked earlier about the noises that we have some control over, and this is very important for the recording session. We want to make sure that during the session, the furnace doesn't go on, the air conditioning compressor doesn't kick in. We don't want somebody upstairs flushing a toilet and hearing that sound of water rushing through come down there. We don't want somebody upstairs vacuuming the floor. So you need to take all those things into consideration and make sure that none of those things are going to happen. So what I've done is make up a checklist to make sure I don't forget anything. It has instructions on how to set the HVAC controls so that we make sure that that's not going to come on. We shut down the hot water heater. We make sure that anybody that's also in the building realizes that we're recording and they have to take those things into consideration and make sure that they know that when we're recording they can't make any noise. Headphones are obviously very important for many sessions. In our case, the drummer is isolated in a separate room. He can't see the rest of the musicians, so headphones to him are his only connection with the rest of the players. Same with the other players as far as the drummer is concerned. So we have to make sure that they all have headphones, that they have the volume in the headphone that they need, the mix in the headphones that they need. As the musicians are starting to play the song and you're getting levels and so on for the recording, it's important to ask them periodically if the headphones are okay. Can they hear what they need? Can they hear themselves? Can they hear everybody else? And make sure you make whatever changes are necessary so that they can hear perfectly. Because if they're not comfortable, they're not going to perform at their best. Sometimes you'll know better than they will what they need. If you discover that one of the players is having trouble with time, it may be he doesn't have enough drums in his headphones. And even if he says that everything's fine, pushing up the drums a little bit for him may be just what it needed in order to get everything to fit together better. I mentioned earlier that I've been recording for a long time, almost 50 years. And as a consequence, most of the people that I work with are people that I've worked with over a long period of time. Occasionally there'll be somebody new, but I tend to stick with the people that I've recorded a lot over the years. So we have a very good rapport. We understand the process, and it makes the sessions go very smoothly. Over the many decades that I've been recording, one thing that I've learned is that in most cases, the ideal take happens at about the third or fourth take. Usually after the fourth or fifth take, people start getting tired, bored of the song, and really just wishing it to be over. And as a consequence, the performance deteriorates after that. Now, there are exceptions. Some people can go for many, many, many takes and still perform just as well and maybe even keep improving. But as a general rule, it's going to be in those first few takes when you get your optimum performance. So you, as the recordist, and in this case, making those kinds of decisions, you have to be aware of when the performance reaches its peak and starts to go down. Generally, what I do is go one or two takes beyond where I think the optimum was, and then when we listen back to it, we usually all agree that take 4 or whatever was the best one. But it's important to start recording right from the beginning. As soon as you have things reasonably close to being the way you want it set up, hit the record button and start recording. Often that first run-through is the most relaxed of the whole session because people don't feel the pressure of knowing that they're being recorded. And it can be often that that's the best take you're going to get for the day. As for me, I'll always go with the take that has the best feel, even if it's not the most perfect. Now, I think one of the worst things you can do is to make players keep playing over and over and over again while you set up mics and get sounds and play with EQ and all that sort of thing. It's very destructive to their creativity, and they're not going to give you the best performance. So my rule of thumb is as soon as I have it reasonably close, I'm going to start recording. And it may not be right, the levels may not be perfect. If I'm adding any effects to it during the recording, it may not be set exactly right. But I think it's more important to start recording than it is to worry about getting everything perfect. So what happens if you're doing take after take after take, and each time somebody makes a mistake or for whatever reason they're just not happy with the result? At that point, it's probably best to take a break. Maybe everybody's getting hungry and tired, wants to get something to eat, or just relax and not think about the song for a few minutes. And that's probably a good idea. And good producers know when to tell the musicians, let's take a break, let's do something different. Now, if you've gone for hours and hours and you're still not getting it, it may be time to make a complete change. And that could be deciding to call it a day and forget about doing this recording that day because it's just not happening, or maybe moving on to another song. At the end of the session, it's probably a good idea to do a quick reference mix. You don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but just something so that you and the performers have something to take home that they can listen to and think about for the future. Because chances are you're not really done the song. You probably have other overdubs to do, other parts to add. And even if you do have all the tracks recorded, you probably need some time to think about the song, what you've got, listen to the tracks, and make some decisions before you sit down to do the mix.
When you turn your back, when you walk away and leave it all behind, when you close your eyes, when you dream up lies, when you take off on a dime,